The summer heat blazed down on the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists from around the world gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 17-year-old Marcus Thompson, a wealthy American teenager visiting London with his family. His designer clothes and expensive watch caught the sunlight as he pushed through the crowd with little regard for others around him. Marcus had grown up with everything handed to him on a silver platter. His father owned a chain of luxury hotels and his mother came from old money. Throughout his life, nobody had ever truly challenged his behavior or put him in his place. He believed that money and status gave him the right to act however he pleased wherever he went. The royal guard stood perfectly still in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. Their faces remained expressionless as they maintained their positions, rifles held firmly at their sides. To most visitors, these guards represented centuries of British tradition and deserved the utmost respect. But to Marcus, they were nothing more than tourist attractions, like living statues placed there for his entertainment. As the crowd pressed closer to get better photographs, Marcus noticed how seriously everyone was taking the ceremony. Families whispered quietly to their children about showing respect. Tour guides spoke in hushed tones about the honor and dedication required to become a royal guard. The atmosphere was one of reverence and admiration for these silent sentinels who protected the royal family. Marcus rolled his eyes at what he saw as unnecessary formality. He had been dragged to London by his parents who wanted to expose him to culture and history, but all he wanted was to get back to his hotel and video chat with his friends back home in Beverly Hills. The whole trip felt like a waste of his summer vacation, and his attitude showed in every gesture and expression. Standing next to one particular guard who appeared to be around his own age, Marcus began to feel a twisted sense of superiority. Here was someone his age who had to stand perfectly still in the hot sun, dressed in what Marcus considered a ridiculous costume, unable to move or speak while tourists gawked at him. Marcus felt powerful in comparison, free to do and say whatever he wanted while this young man was trapped in his formal duties. The guard in question was actually 22-year-old James Mitchell, though he looked younger than his years. James had worked incredibly hard to earn his position in the Queen's Guard. He came from a working-class family in Manchester and had joined the military straight out of school. The rigorous training, physical demands, and mental discipline required to become a royal guard had shaped him into a person of remarkable self-control and quiet strength. James had been standing at his post for over an hour, maintaining perfect posture despite the heat and the weight of his uniform. His training had taught him to remain focused regardless of distractions, weather conditions, or the behavior of tourists. He had seen it all during his time on duty: people trying to make him laugh, tourists taking inappropriate photos, and occasionally, disrespectful visitors who tried to test his patience. As Marcus observed James, an idea began forming in his mind. He had heard stories about these guards and how they were not supposed to react to anything. Marcus wondered just how far he could push before getting a response. His friends back home would never believe that he had managed to break the composure of a royal guard. The thought of having such a story to tell filled him with excitement and a cruel sense of anticipation. The other tourists continued to maintain a respectful distance, taking photos from appropriate angles and speaking in quiet voices. Children held their parents' hands and stared in wonder at the impressive guards. Elderly visitors shared stories with their grandchildren about the importance of these traditions. Everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special and historically significant, but Marcus felt no such reverence or respect. Instead, he saw an opportunity to assert his perceived superiority and create what he thought would be an amusing situation. He began to move closer to James, positioning himself where he could have maximum impact. His expensive sneakers made soft sounds on the ancient stones as he approached, and his smirk grew wider with each step. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget. What he did not realize was that his target was not just any young man in a costume, but a highly trained professional with years of experience dealing with exactly this type of disrespectful behavior. James had the skills, authority, and legal backing to respond in ways that Marcus could never have imagined. As Marcus prepared to make his move, other tourists began to notice his approach and the look on his face. Some sensed that something inappropriate was about to happen, but none felt comfortable speaking up to a stranger. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus closed the distance between himself and the unsuspecting guard, completely unaware that his next actions would change his perspective forever. Marcus stepped directly in front of James, blocking the guard's forward view and positioning himself uncomfortably close. The other tourists immediately noticed the inappropriate behavior and began stepping back, creating a small circle around the unfolding situation. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen, while others looked around nervously for security personnel. With a loud, mocking voice that carried across the courtyard, Marcus began his verbal assault. "Hey there, toy soldier. How does it feel to be a living statue? Do you actually get paid to stand there like a dummy? Or is this some kind of community service?" His words were deliberately chosen to be as disrespectful and humiliating as possible, designed to provoke a reaction that would satisfy his cruel sense of entertainment. James remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead as his training dictated. He had heard far worse during his service, and his professional composure was unshakable. However, Marcus interpreted this lack of response as weakness rather than strength, fueling his confidence to escalate his behavior even further. Emboldened by what he perceived as success, Marcus began to circle around James like a predator toying with its prey. "I bet you're not even a real soldier. You're probably just some actor they hired to stand here and look important. My dad probably pays more in taxes than you make in a year." His voice grew louder and more aggressive with each insult, drawing the attention of every person in the immediate vicinity. The crowd of tourists was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior. Several people began pulling their children away from the scene, while others whispered among themselves about the young man's shocking disrespect. Some visitors, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely end badly for Marcus, began recording the encounter on their phones. Marcus then made his biggest mistake yet. He reached out and deliberately poked James in the shoulder with his finger, a clear physical contact that crossed every line of acceptable behavior. "Hello? Anyone home in there? I'm talking to you, Tin Man." The poke was not just disrespectful but technically an assault on a member of the Royal Guard, a serious offense under British law. This physical contact triggered something in James that went beyond personal offense. His training had prepared him for verbal abuse, inappropriate photos, and general disrespect. But physical assault was an entirely different matter. As a Royal Guard, he had both the authority and the responsibility to respond to direct threats to his person and position. For the first time since Marcus had approached, James's eyes moved. They shifted down to look directly at the arrogant teenager, and Marcus suddenly found himself staring into the steel-gray eyes of a professionally trained soldier. The intensity of that gaze was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Gone was any pretense that this was just a costumed actor or ceremonial figure. "Sir, you have just committed assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard," James said in a voice that was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His words were spoken clearly and loudly enough for everyone in the surrounding area to hear. "You will step back immediately and cease this behavior, or you will face the full consequences of your actions." Marcus was momentarily stunned by the response, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. Instead of recognizing the seriousness of the situation, he laughed loudly and mockingly. "Oh, look, the statue can talk. What are you going to do about it? Call your mommy? You can't even move from that spot." His laughter echoed off the palace walls, but he failed to notice that no one else was laughing with him. The other tourists had now formed a wide circle around the confrontation, many of them filming what they recognized as a potentially historic moment of someone learning a very hard lesson. Some of the more experienced travelers who understood British protocol began shaking their heads, knowing that Marcus had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. James took a single step forward, a movement that was precise, deliberate, and carried the weight of centuries of military tradition. That one step immediately changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Suddenly, Marcus was no longer confronting a static figure but was face to face with an active member of one of the world's most elite military units. "You are now interfering with a Royal Guard in the performance of his duties," James continued, his voice growing more authoritative with each word. "This is a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment. You have exactly 10 seconds to remove yourself from this area and cease your disruptive behavior." For the first time since beginning his verbal assault, Marcus felt a flutter of genuine concern. The transformation in James was dramatic and undeniable. The young man, who had seemed like a helpless target, moments before now radiated an aura of controlled power and authority that made Marcus's expensive clothes and confident attitude seem suddenly insignificant, but Marcus's pride and lifelong lack of consequences prevented him from backing down. Instead of apologizing and walking away, he doubled down on his aggressive behavior, setting himself up for a humiliation that would be witnessed by dozens of tourists and potentially viewed by millions online. His next words would seal his fate and provide James with all the justification needed to demonstrate exactly why royal guards are among the most respected and feared soldiers in the world. Marcus's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment as he realized that dozens of people were now watching his confrontation with the guard. His pride wounded and his authority challenged, he decided to escalate the situation even further rather than accept defeat. "You don't scare me," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with the strain. "I'm an American citizen. You can't touch me." James's expression remained completely professional, but his stance shifted slightly into what trained observers would recognize as a combat-ready position. His years of military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond with appropriate force. Marcus's continued aggression and refusal to comply with lawful orders had moved the situation into dangerous territory. "Sir, this is your final warning," James announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard with military precision. "You will step back and leave this area immediately, or I will be forced to detain you for assault, harassment, and interference with royal duties. The choice is yours." The crowd of tourists had grown larger as word spread through the palace grounds about the confrontation taking place. People were pulling out phones and cameras, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some visitors began whispering explanations to their children about why the young man's behavior was so inappropriate and dangerous. Marcus looked around at all the faces staring at him and felt a moment of panic. This was not going according to his plan at all. He had expected to humiliate the guard and create a funny story to tell his friends. Instead, he found himself the center of negative attention, being filmed by strangers, and facing down a soldier who clearly meant business. But instead of taking the opportunity to apologize and walk away, Marcus's spoiled upbringing and complete lack of experience with real consequences led him to make another terrible decision. He pulled out his phone and began recording James, shoving the device close to the guard's face while speaking in a mocking, sing-song voice. "Look, everyone, I found a cranky toy soldier who thinks he's scary. Watch this." Marcus then reached out with his free hand and actually grabbed at James's rifle, attempting to pose for what he thought would be a humorous selfie. This action crossed every possible line and moved the situation from misconduct into the realm of serious criminal behavior. The moment Marcus's hand made contact with the rifle, James moved with lightning speed that stunned everyone watching. In one fluid motion perfected through countless hours of training, James secured his weapon, grabbed Marcus's wrist, and spun the teenager around into a professional restraint hold. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and was executed with a precision that left no doubt about James's military expertise. Marcus found himself face down on the ancient cobblestones with his arm twisted behind, his back in a grip that was both completely secure and carefully controlled to avoid injury. His expensive phone skittered across the ground, the screen cracking as it hit the stone. The transformation from aggressor to helpless captive was so sudden and complete that Marcus could barely process what had happened. "Help! Police, this maniac is attacking me!" Marcus screamed, his voice high with panic and disbelief. He struggled against James's hold but quickly discovered that any movement only made his position more uncomfortable. The professional restraint technique was designed to subdue without causing harm, but it was absolutely inescapable without cooperation. James spoke clearly and calmly, ensuring his words carried to all the witnesses. "You are under citizen's arrest for assault on a member of the Royal Guard, attempted theft of military equipment, and criminal harassment. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used against you in court." The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and nervous laughter. Many of the tourists were clearly delighted to see the arrogant young man finally receive consequences for his appalling behavior. Others pulled out their phones to capture the dramatic conclusion to the confrontation they had witnessed from the beginning. Marcus's parents, who had been shopping in the palace gift shop, arrived just in time to see their son being held on the ground by a royal guard, while a crowd of strangers filmed the scene. His mother screamed and rushed forward while his father stood frozen in shock and embarrassment, immediately understanding that his son had done something seriously wrong. "Let go of my son. How dare you assault him?" Marcus's mother shrieked, but James calmly explained the situation to her while maintaining his professional hold on Marcus. Several witnesses volunteered to explain exactly what they had seen, making it clear that Marcus had been the aggressor throughout the entire encounter. Within minutes, the distinctive sound of police sirens could be heard approaching the palace. James had activated a silent alarm during the confrontation, summoning backup as soon as Marcus had made physical contact with his weapon. The Metropolitan Police took threats to royal security very seriously, and multiple units were responding to the incident. As Marcus lay on the cobblestones with his cheek pressed against the ancient stones, he began to realize that his actions were going to have real consequences. The stories he had heard about London police not carrying guns and British people being overly polite seemed suddenly irrelevant as he faced the reality of being arrested in a foreign country for assaulting a royal guard. The Metropolitan Police arrived in force with multiple vehicles and officers responding to what was classified as a potential security threat at Buckingham Palace. The lead officer, Sergeant Williams, was a 20-year veteran who had seen every type of incident imaginable, but he was still impressed by James's professional handling of the situation. "What's the situation here, Guard Mitchell?" Sergeant Williams asked as he approached the scene. James maintained his hold on Marcus while providing a clear, concise report of everything that had occurred, from the initial verbal harassment to the physical assault and attempted grabbing of his rifle. Marcus tried to interrupt several times, claiming that he was the victim and demanding that the police arrest James instead. His protest grew more frantic as he realized that none of the officers were taking his complaint seriously. "This is insane. I barely touched him. He attacked me for no reason. I want to speak to the American embassy right now." Sergeant Williams knelt down next to Marcus and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "Son, you're in quite a bit of trouble here. Assaulting a member of the Royal Guard is a very serious offense in this country. I suggest you stop talking and start thinking about getting yourself a good lawyer." As James released his hold and stepped back, Marcus scrambled to his feet, his expensive clothes now dirty and wrinkled from his time on the cobblestones. He looked around desperately for support from the crowd but found only disapproving faces and pointing fingers. Several tourists were still filming, capturing his disheveled appearance and panicked expression for posterity. The police began taking statements from witnesses, and Marcus's heart sank as person after person described his aggressive behavior in detail. An elderly British woman was particularly eloquent in her description of his absolutely appalling conduct and complete lack of respect for our traditions. A father from Germany explained how he had moved his children away because Marcus's behavior was so inappropriate and frightening. Marcus's parents arrived at his side, his mother still demanding answers while his father tried to assess the legal situation they were facing. Mr. Thompson was a successful businessman who understood the importance of minimizing damage when things went wrong, and he could see immediately that his son had created a disaster of significant proportions. "Officer, I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding," Mr. Thompson began, pulling out his wallet in a gesture that made several British onlookers visibly cringe. "Perhaps we can settle this matter quietly? My son is young and didn't understand the cultural differences." Sergeant Williams' expression hardened noticeably at the implied suggestion of bribery. "Sir, your son committed several serious crimes in full view of dozens of witnesses. This is not a cultural misunderstanding or a matter that can be settled with money. He will be formally charged and processed through the proper legal channels." The handcuffs clicked into place around Marcus's wrists as the reality of his situation finally began to sink in. He was actually being arrested in a foreign country, and all of his family's money and influence seemed powerless to stop what was happening. The cold metal against his skin was a sharp reminder that actions have consequences, regardless of one's background or perceived status. As Marcus was led toward the police vehicle, James resumed his position at his post with the same professional demeanor he had maintained throughout the entire incident. To him, dealing with disruptive tourists was simply part of the job, and he showed no signs of satisfaction or anger about what had occurred. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and he had handled it by the book. The crowd of tourists began to disperse, many of them discussing what they had witnessed and expressing satisfaction that the arrogant young man had finally faced consequences for his behavior. Several people approached James to thank him for his professionalism and to express their admiration for how he had handled the situation. Marcus's mother rode in the police car with him, alternating between scolding him for his stupidity and promising that the family lawyers would fix everything. But Marcus was beginning to understand that this situation was beyond his parents' ability to simply make disappear. He was in a foreign country, had been arrested for serious crimes, and faced the possibility of significant legal consequences. The police station was a stark, institutional building that bore no resemblance to the luxury hotels and private clubs that Marcus was accustomed to. As he was processed through the system, fingerprinted and photographed, the reality of his situation became increasingly clear. He was no longer a privileged teenager on vacation, but a criminal suspect facing charges in the British legal system. During his initial interview with detectives, Marcus attempted to minimize his actions and blame others for the situation. He claimed that James had overreacted and that the whole incident was blown out of proportion. However, the multiple video recordings from tourist phones provided clear evidence of his aggressive behavior and left no room for alternative interpretations of what had occurred. The detective handling his case, Inspector Davies, had dealt with many similar situations involving entitled tourists who believed their nationality or wealth exempted them from local laws. She explained to Marcus in clear terms exactly what charges he was facing and what the potential consequences could be, including the possibility of imprisonment and a permanent criminal record that would affect his ability to travel internationally in the future. The holding cell was a harsh introduction to reality for Marcus, who had never spent a night anywhere that didn't have room service and Egyptian cotton sheets. The bare concrete walls, metal bench, and single toilet in the corner were a shocking contrast to the luxury he had always taken for granted. He sat in stunned silence as the gravity of his situation slowly sank in. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading rapidly across social media. Multiple tourists had uploaded their videos of the confrontation, and the footage was being shared thousands of times with hashtags like #arrogant_tourist and #Royal Guard Justice. Marcus had no idea that his humiliation was becoming a viral sensation, watched by millions of people around the world. The videos clearly showed every detail of his aggressive behavior, from his initial mocking comments to his physical assault on James and his attempt to grab the rifle. Social media users were having a field day with his entitled attitude and complete lack of respect for British traditions. Comments poured in from people expressing satisfaction at seeing him face consequences for his actions. Marcus's father spent the night frantically, calling lawyers and trying to understand the British legal system. He discovered that his son was facing charges of assault, harassment, and interfering with a member of the Royal Guard in the performance of their duties. These were serious criminal offenses that could result in significant fines, imprisonment, and a permanent criminal record. The family's usual lawyer, back in Beverly Hills, was completely out of his depth when it came to British criminal law. Mr. Thompson had to hire expensive local counsel who specialized in international incidents, and even they warned him that the case would be difficult to defend given the clear video evidence of Marcus's behavior. The next morning, Marcus appeared before a magistrate for his initial hearing. The courtroom was packed with journalists who had caught wind of the story, particularly after the videos went viral online. Marcus looked pale and shaken as he stood before the judge, still wearing his wrinkled designer clothes from the previous day. The prosecutor outlined the charges against Marcus in detail, emphasizing the seriousness of assaulting a member of the Royal Guard and the clear evidence of his guilt. The video footage was played in court, showing Marcus's progression from verbal harassment to physical assault, and the judge watched with obvious disapproval at his behavior. Marcus's expensive lawyer argued that his client was young and had made a mistake due to cultural differences and jet lag. He requested that Marcus be released on bail and allowed to return to the United States while awaiting trial. However, the prosecutor argued that Marcus was a flight risk who had shown complete disrespect for British law and institutions. The magistrate denied bail, stating that Marcus's behavior demonstrated a serious disregard for the law and that there was a significant risk he would flee the country to avoid facing trial. Marcus would remain in custody until his case could be heard in full, which could take several weeks or even months given the backlog in the court system. The reality of spending weeks or months in a British prison hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never been away from his comfort zone for more than a few days, and the thought of being locked up in a foreign country was terrifying. His privileged upbringing had left him completely unprepared for the harsh realities of the criminal justice system. Back at Buckingham Palace, James continued his duties as if nothing had happened. His commanding officer commended him for his professional handling of the situation and his textbook response to the threat. The incident would become part of his service record as an example of proper protocol when dealing with aggressive tourists. The story continued to gain international attention, with news outlets picking up the viral videos and reporting on the incident. Marcus became an unwitting poster child for entitled tourist behavior, and his mugshot appeared in newspapers around the world alongside articles about respecting local customs and laws while traveling abroad. His parents were forced to extend their stay in London indefinitely, moving from their luxury hotel to a more modest accommodation, as they faced mounting legal bills and an uncertain timeline for resolution. Mrs. Thompson was horrified by the negative publicity and the damage to their family's reputation, while Mr. Thompson struggled to understand how his son's attitude had led to such serious consequences. The other tourists who had witnessed the incident were interviewed by news outlets, and their accounts consistently painted Marcus as the clear aggressor who had brought his troubles upon himself. Many expressed admiration for James's professionalism and restraint in dealing with such inappropriate behavior. Marcus's friends back home in Beverly Hills initially thought the whole situation was exaggerated until they saw the videos themselves. The clear evidence of his aggressive behavior and subsequent humiliation made it impossible for them to defend his actions. Some distanced themselves from him entirely, not wanting to be associated with someone who had become an international symbol of ugly American tourist behavior. As Marcus sat in his cell contemplating his situation, he began to realize that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond a simple vacation mishap. His future plans for college, travel, and career opportunities were all now in jeopardy because of a few minutes of arrogant behavior that he had thought would make for an amusing story. 3 weeks into his detention, Marcus had undergone a dramatic transformation. The cocky, entitled teenager who had mocked James outside Buckingham Palace was gone, replaced by a humbled young man who was beginning to understand the weight of his actions. Prison life had been a brutal education in reality, for someone who had never faced genuine hardship or consequences. His cellmate was a career criminal named Tommy who found Marcus's situation both amusing and pathetic. "You threw away your whole future to mess with a guard who was just doing his job," Tommy observed during one of their conversations. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And I've heard some stupid things in here." Marcus's daily routine consisted of basic prison meals, limited recreation time, and long hours of reflection in his cell. He had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him to this point, and for the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the reality that his actions had hurt other people and violated principles he had never bothered to consider. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings continued to move forward. Marcus's lawyers were working to negotiate a plea deal that might reduce his sentence, but the Crown Prosecution Service was taking a hard line on the case. The incident had received so much publicity that it had become a symbol of the need to protect British institutions and traditions from disrespectful tourists. The viral videos had now been viewed millions of times across various social media platforms, making Marcus one of the most recognizable faces on the internet for all the wrong reasons. Memes had been created using screenshots from the footage, and his name had become synonymous with entitled tourist behavior. The incident was being used in travel guides and cultural sensitivity training as an example of what not to do when visiting foreign countries. Marcus's parents visited him regularly, bringing updates from his legal team and news from home. His father had been forced to take extended time away from his business to deal with the situation, causing significant financial and professional stress. His mother struggled with the public humiliation and the damage to their family's social standing in their Beverly Hills community. During one particularly difficult visit, Marcus's mother broke down in tears as she described how their family friends were avoiding them and how the incident had affected his younger sister's social life at school. "How could you be so selfish?" she asked through her tears. "Did you ever think about how your actions would affect the rest of us?" For the first time, Marcus truly understood that his behavior had consequences beyond himself. He had always been the center of his own universe, never considering how his actions might impact others. The sight of his mother's pain and his father's stress forced him to confront the reality that his arrogance had hurt the people who loved him most. James, meanwhile, had returned to his normal duties and routine. He occasionally thought about the incident but felt no particular animosity toward Marcus. His military training had taught him that people sometimes make poor decisions under stress or due to immaturity, and he hoped that the young man would learn from the experience and become a better person. The media attention surrounding the case had also brought positive recognition to the Royal Guards and their important role in protecting British institutions. James received commendations from his superiors and letters of support from people around the world who admired his professionalism in handling the situation. As Marcus's trial date approached, his legal team finally managed to negotiate a plea agreement with the prosecution. In exchange for pleading guilty to all charges and accepting responsibility for his actions, Marcus would receive a sentence of 6 months in prison with the possibility of early release for good behavior, plus substantial fines and community service requirements. The plea agreement also required Marcus to issue a formal public apology to James, the Royal Guard institution, and the British people for his disrespectful behavior. This apology would be recorded and made available to the media as part of the resolution of the case. Marcus struggled with the decision to accept the plea deal, as it meant admitting guilt and accepting a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. However, his lawyers explained that going to trial with such clear video evidence would likely result in a much harsher sentence and even more negative publicity. The night before he was scheduled to enter his plea, Marcus wrote a letter to James that he asked his lawyer to deliver. In it, he expressed genuine remorse for his behavior and acknowledged that the guard had been simply doing his job with honor and professionalism. He admitted that his actions had been inexcusable and that he deserved the consequences he was facing. The letter was a far cry from the arrogant, mocking attitude he had displayed outside Buckingham Palace. Prison had forced him to examine his values and behavior in ways that his privileged upbringing never had. He was beginning to understand concepts like respect, responsibility, and the importance of treating others with dignity regardless of their position or status. When Marcus appeared in court to enter his guilty plea, he was a changed person from the teenager who had been arrested weeks earlier. He spoke clearly and took full responsibility for his actions, expressing genuine remorse for his behavior and the embarrassment he had caused to his family and country. The judge acknowledged Marcus's apparent transformation but emphasized that actions have consequences, regardless of age or background. The sentence was designed not only to punish Marcus, but to send a clear message to other potential offenders that disrespectful and criminal behavior toward British institutions would not be tolerated. 6 months later, Marcus walked out of prison a fundamentally different person than the one who had entered. The arrogant teenager who had thought he could mock and assault a royal guard with impunity was gone, replaced by a young man who understood the value of respect, humility, and personal responsibility. The transformation was so complete that even his parents struggled to recognize the mature person their son had become. His first stop after release was Buckingham Palace, where he had arranged through his lawyer to meet with James and deliver his formal apology in person. Marcus was nervous as he approached the palace grounds, remembering the last time he had been there and how differently this encounter would unfold. James agreed to meet with Marcus during his off-duty time, curious to see how the experience had affected the young man. When they met in a private room at the palace, Marcus was struck by how normal and approachable James seemed when not in his formal guard uniform. Here was someone close to his own age who had shown remarkable professionalism and restraint in the face of Marcus's appalling behavior. "I want to apologize not just for what I did, but for who I was that day," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with genuine emotion. I was disrespectful, arrogant, and completely wrong. You were doing your job with honor, and I attacked you for no reason other than my own stupidity and sense of entitlement." James listened carefully to Marcus's apology and was impressed by its sincerity. He could see that the young man had genuinely learned from his experience and was taking full responsibility for his actions. "I accept your apology," James replied. "I hope this experience has taught you something valuable about respect and consequences." The two young men talked for nearly an hour, with James sharing insights about his military service and the pride he took in his role as a royal guard. Marcus listened intently, finally understanding the honor and dedication required for such a position. He realized that his initial perception of James as a toy soldier had been not only disrespectful but completely wrong. Marcus's public apology video was released shortly after their meeting and quickly went viral, just as the original incident footage had months earlier. However, this time the response was largely positive, with many people commenting on his apparent growth and maturity. The video became a powerful example of how people can learn from their mistakes and become better individuals. The criminal record would follow Marcus for the rest of his life, affecting his ability to travel to certain countries and potentially impacting future employment and educational opportunities. However, he had come to accept this as a fair consequence for his actions and was determined to make the most of his second chance. Marcus's relationship with his parents had also evolved significantly during his incarceration. They had been forced to examine their own role in raising a child who felt entitled to treat others with such disrespect. The family began attending counseling together to address the underlying issues that had contributed to Marcus's behavior and to rebuild their relationships on a healthier foundation. Upon returning to the United States, Marcus found that his notoriety had preceded him. The videos of both his original offense and his subsequent apology had made him a recognizable figure, and he faced a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and, surprisingly, respect from those who appreciated his willingness to take responsibility for his mistakes. His plans for college had been disrupted by his criminal record, as several universities withdrew their acceptance offers once the incident became public knowledge. However, Marcus was determined to continue his education and eventually found acceptance at a smaller college that was willing to give him a second chance based on his demonstrated growth and commitment to making amends. Marcus decided to use his experience as a force for positive change. He began speaking at high schools and youth organizations about the importance of cultural respect, the consequences of entitled behavior, and the value of taking responsibility for one's actions. His story resonated with many young people who could relate to making mistakes and needing to learn from them. The speaking engagements also served as a form of ongoing community service, which had been part of his sentence requirements. Marcus discovered that he had a talent for connecting with audiences and helping them understand the serious consequences that can result from seemingly minor acts of disrespect and poor judgment. Years later, Marcus would often reflect on that fateful day at Buckingham Palace as the most important moment of his life. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate someone else had instead become the catalyst for his own transformation, from an entitled, arrogant teenager into a responsible adult who understood the value of treating others with dignity and respect. James continued his distinguished service as a royal guard and eventually rose through the ranks to become a training instructor for new recruits. He would sometimes share the story of his encounter with Marcus as an example of how to handle difficult situations with professionalism and appropriate force, and how even the most challenging encounters could sometimes lead to positive outcomes for everyone involved. The incident became a case study in several contexts. Criminal justice programs used it to illustrate the importance of consequences for antisocial behavior. Cultural sensitivity training incorporated it as an example of what not to do when traveling abroad, and social media literacy courses referenced it to demonstrate how quickly poor decisions can become viral. Sensations with lasting consequences. Marcus's transformation also had a positive impact on his family relationships. His parents, forced to confront their own role in raising an entitled child, became more involved in charitable work and began teaching their children about privilege, responsibility, and the importance of treating all people with respect regardless of their position in life. The viral videos that had once been a source of shame for Marcus eventually became powerful tools for education and change. The stark contrast between his arrogant behavior in the original footage and his sincere, humble apology demonstrated that people truly can learn from their mistakes and become better versions of themselves. Marcus's story served as a reminder that respect is not something that can be demanded based on wealth, nationality, or perceived status, but must be earned through one's actions and treatment of others. The royal guard, who had seemed like an easy target for mockery, had instead become the instrument of a life-changing lesson that would benefit not only Marcus, but everyone who heard his story. In the end, what had begun as a moment of cruel entertainment had transformed into a powerful example of justice, growth, and redemption. Marcus learned that true strength comes not from putting others down, but from building them up and treating everyone with the dignity they deserve. The arrogant teenager who had mocked a royal guard was gone forever, replaced by a man who understood that every person deserves respect, regardless of their role in life.